स्टार्टअप्स का ये कल्चर देश के दूर दराज तक पहुंचे, इसके लिए 16 जनवरी को अब नेशनल स्टार्टअप डे के रूप में मनाने का फैसला भी किया गया है।
A resilient nation is only built when billions of dreams across every corner of the nation are nurtured. When every idea and aspiration gets wings to fly. When everyone plays a role in building one of the most promising economies of the world. Startup India was founded 7 years back in 2016 by our Honorable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi and propel it towards becoming one of the largest innovation ecosystem in the world. Today, India is one of the fastest growing startup ecosystems in the world. We are adding highest number of startups every day in the world. From 8 unicorns in 2016 to 108 unicorns today, we have emerged as the world's third largest unicorn nation. All of this has been possible through the impact of over 54 regulatory reforms that Startup India has brought about since 2016 to increase the ease of doing business, ease of raising investments and reduce compliance burden.
When government takes a responsibility of something, it takes proper care that it reaches every nook and corner of the country. So Startup India has been playing and will be playing a major role in the growth story of our country. And very soon, India will not only be seen as the largest consumer market, but also as the largest producer market of the world.
From 4 state policies in 2016, today we have 31 states and UTs with dedicated startup policies, spreading the reach of entrepreneurship to 663 districts.
I believe it's a great success for Startup India mission, and we have seen like people coming from different background and financial situation. All these schemes made the dream get closer to the reality, and it's been a great journey with Startup India.
We have grown immensely from 446 to 87,000 plus DPIIT recognized startups across 56 industries, employing over 8.48 lakh people.
Last 7 years have seen an exponential growth in the number of startups and in the different kind of startups that are coming out in India. This is all possible due to the last 7 years journey of Startup India thinking about policies in a wholesome manner.
Various initiatives by Startup India have enabled this momentous growth, including National Startup Awards, State's Startup Ranking Framework, Seed Fund Scheme and the Government E-Marketplace or GEM.
Startup India has actually created a very good systems and processes for adoption of such technologies into government ecosystem. That's really helped us tremendously. And the platforms like GEM, the government e-marketplace, they have specific areas where startups can sell their product to government ecosystems.
This incredible journey spanning over 7 years has transformed India through its zeal for entrepreneurship and innovation. This is only the beginning of our journey to a more innovative and inclusive idea. A nation of not just job seekers, but also job creators. Start innovations. Start dreams. Start aspirations. Start hope. Start opportunities. Start possibilities. Start the future. Startup India.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Neha Nagpal from Startup India team. And today we have a masterclass on responsible investing mechanisms with the who's who of the investment ecosystem of the country. Thanks for joining in, everybody. I would take a minute to introduce all the speakers that we have with us today. We have Sorry, I think there's some network issue. Yeah. We have Mr. Manoj Kumar, who's the founder of Social Alpha, a multi-stage innovation curation and venture development platform for science and technology startups specifically. Prior to founding Social Alpha, Mr. Manoj has been an entrepreneur himself and he's been an early stage venture investor. He currently serves on the board of various companies, non-profits, and research organizations. We also have with us Ms. Lavanya Ashok. Ms. Lavanya is a general partner at Trifecta Capital and who joined the firm in 2020 and led to the launch of firm's growth equity investing business. In the past 2 years, the firm has set up 250 dollars million growth equity fund and made investments in 10 category leading tech companies. Lavanya has 17 years of investing and investment banking experience under her belt. And earlier in her career, she's also worked with SPO Partners, which is a hedge fund in California. So she brings experience across the world, across the border also in India. So welcome, Miss Lavanya. We also have with us Mr. Mithun John, who leads the startup vertical at HDFC Bank, India's largest private sector bank. Prior to this, he was the head of Maharashtra State Innovation Society, the nodal agency of government of Maharashtra to support startups. And so that's why Mr. Mithun has also been in the ecosystem in different ways from the angle of the states and now, with the bank as well. So I welcome all three of you today to the panel. And I hope we have extremely insightful discussions on responsible investing. Thank you so much for joining us. And I will just start with the topic of today, which is responsible investing. And this is essentially a masterclass on responsible investing. So just to sort of give context to our viewers also, while startup investing and fundraising is one of the biggest topics across the country right now, and we're churning out unicorns on a daily basis, and there are very high funding sort of numbers across the board across the country, and there's an extreme interest in India as a market as well. But one thing which is extremely important right now is sustainability of this financing, right? Which is where responsible investing comes in, which is where ESG framework of investing comes in. And there is a growing trend of understanding what investing means, except for profits, except for the goal of earning profits, what an investor should look at while investing in a startup, how startups which are working in the social sector also look for investors, because again, that is a space wherein the number of investors are unfortunately a little limited, and how the overall perspective of investing needs to change, keeping in mind the broader macroeconomic goals of um, India and in fact the world as well, and what the importance of the ESG framework and environment and sustainability and governance will be over the next 10 to 15 years. So I think with that in mind, I will give the floor to all the panelists, and I'll start with Mr. Manoj, who has a whole firm that you have which is focused on social impact startups, right? So I would just, Manoj, want you to talk a little bit about what responsible investing means to you and social alpha in general, how social impact and social investing is different from responsible investing, and just your view about it. So looking forward to your words here.
Thank you, Neha. Thanks for inviting me. It's really a privilege to come and talk here. And let me start with a very positive statement that responsible investing is becoming mainstream. And increasingly, especially if you look at the growth equity investment, increasingly you will see people talking about ESG and responsible investing. Uh, there are two things which are fundamentally changing this. One, the limited partners are interested in working with GPs who actually align their investment objectives with ESG, but also corporates, because of the consumer pressure as well as the increasing responsibility, they are also subscribing to ESG, right? So it's really, if you see public markets, it's becoming a mainstream trend. What we need to do is to shift this to early stage, startups as well as very early stage markets where one, the capital is not enough, and two, wherever capital allocation is happening, it's happening in emerging areas, right? So there are certain sectors of the economy which are still not getting investment, and that is why you see government playing a very powerful role there. Like the region you had to set up a startup seed fund basically indicates that there is not enough private capital available in that space, and that's why it's coming from public finance, right? So as long as there is public finance providing equity at early stage, it is an indicator that there is not enough private capital moving into that sector. The fundamental shift that we were in our space in social alpha, what we have been seeing, we do not want to compete with the market. Being a not for profit, our objective is not to compete with impact investors or mainstream capital providers. So we identify sectors where capital is not enough, and also within the sectors it's possible that early stage capital is not available but growth stage capital is available, right? So you look at a 2x2 matrix where you differentiate based on which sectors are seeing market failure and also what stage is seeing market failure, right? So you start looking at, say, agriculture, and then you say in agriculture, uh, the deep microbiology for soil and water and food nexus is not getting enough investment, but with series C and beyond there is enough investment, right? So, right, so you create that 2x2 matrix where you identify a sector that is capital starved and a stage that is capital starved and start creating market. So we work very closely in partnership with investors as well as government to identify these sectors, create pipeline, create market, and the moment it becomes mainstream, we get out of that, right? So our objective is not to make money out of this gap, but objective is to create new markets and attract more capital, de-risk these companies, and make them very attractive for people like Lavanya to come and then take a larger stake in this system. I'll come back to this little later. Yeah.
Got it. Thanks a lot, Manoj. And I think the matrix that you're trying to build with the sectors is extremely important. As you mentioned, even government comes in when there is a very clear gap in the ecosystem in a certain space, which is there for social sector to an extent. But also, I would also love to know Lavanya's take on it because, as Manoj mentioned, social alpha strategy is very clearly to not earn profits, and therefore they focus on sectors which are capital starved. But how is responsible investing different, in an organization like Trifecta Capital, or for that matter, any other VC, wherein you have to, at the end of the day, also think about the profits that you're making on that particular investment. So how do you make the combination and the synergy of investing responsibly and social, with the social impact angle in mind, but also with your bottom line in mind?
Sure. No,
So
Neha,
if you can just
of course. Very insightful question, and grateful that the ecosystem has people like Manoj who are doing God's work at the early stage, so that as the ecosystem gets created, more and more companies have a fighting chance of entering growth stage and creating very large scale impact. The way I, as a growth investor, view responsible investing or sustainable investing is, it's almost like, how do you balance the traditional priorities of investing, which is to be a responsible steward of capital, to align your fund objectives with those of your limited partners and deliver the return you promise to them, right? And I think actually sustainable investing quite beautifully balances like more traditional investing priorities with environmental issues, with social issues and government related insights to actually improve the overall quality of returns. Because I think we also live in a world now that people have, beyond reasonable doubt, established is interconnected. There are pressing issues like climate change that need immediate addressing. There are long-term issues like social equity that need continuous addressing. And so the way more traditional investors like myself view this space is almost like an evolution of investing, which is, this has to become part of your overall investment objectives without, of course, sacrificing the promises you made to your limited partners. I think just picking up a thread Manoj said earlier, which really resonated with me, because as I was putting some numbers together for this panel, by popular estimate, by year 2025, over a third of all assets under management will in some shape or form be considered ESG related assets, which is a very large number, right? If you think about traditional capital providers and where their mind space is at and where they view the best investment returns as well as what is best for the planet to be coming from, it is this type of asset class. And this type of investing, in a way, straddles multiple asset classes. So I think it's not an either or for us as growth stage investors. It is an imperative that needs to be woven into the narrative of each investment we make, but very tailored to what it is that specific company is looking to establish and sort of achieve as impact, and then tailor your metrics and your rubric of evaluating how they fare on ESG criteria as a result. So I think we'll get into metrics maybe later in this panel, because I'm sure all the panelists have views on how we should evaluate on an ongoing basis how companies are doing. But I think as an asset class, if they're saying that by 2025 you will have 140 trillion of AUM and over 50 trillion will come from ESG assets, that's really a very sort of powerful number. And I think just beautifully sort of brings to life the fact that capital providers are prioritizing this. And people who are out there, in the ring, the entrepreneurs we're talking to, the large, companies that we're looking at, are all prioritizing this as well.
Got it. I think, Lavanya, what you mentioned about this not being an either or situation, but an imperative even for a VC or a PE fund, and not just funds which are focused on social sector. I think it's very important with the kind of world that we're living in right now to have that as a benchmark. And yes, as you mentioned, we will deep dive into the metrics of ESG in the second half of the webinar. But Mithun would love to also know your views on it, because again, you bring a completely different perspective of a traditional, financial sector bank, right, which is HDFC. So while of course, and that at the onset also is, usually banks invest in more traditional asset classes, and we have seen a recent shift, and it's been a great revolutionary shift where banks have also started investing in startups, working with startups, right? And taking that step forward. Would also want your view on how the banking sector is also looking at responsible investing, and if there are any specific metrics which you look at, and also what is the overall, I would say, the perspective in the banking sector about startups as an asset class, and also social impact startups.
Sure. First of all, Neha, it's great to be a part of this panel, and good work by you and the team at Startup India on sidelines of the upcoming National Startup Day. As far as HDFC Bank goes, we are clearly very aligned to the UN SDG goals. So there's a clear commitment from our side as a bank to be carbon neutral by 2032. Sorry. And now, while just to give you an idea of the depth of work we do within the startup ecosystem, and like you rightly said, we do a fair amount of work with startups. We work with close to about 32,000 startups across the country. Of course, these are, not just impact, it's a mix of, it's across the board, all sectors put together. And, to the extent we work with 80% of the unicorns that are there in the country in one way or the other. Now, where, the social impact part, like Manoj said, I think the ESG part of it is now mainstream. We see a lot of funds, coming forward today, quite clearly focused on, climate change, sustainability, EV, so on and so forth, which is great. And, as a bank, we do lend, we do invest in startups in these sectors. But what's made it even better is a fair amount of support that's coming from the government side. For example, the CGSS scheme that, DPIIT has launched gives us a fair amount of comfort to lend to early stage startups. So as a bank, that's what has powered us. And while we do these investments / lending, what's also important is, while we aim to become a carbon neutral or a bank, it is important to see how we can onboard startups to help you achieve these goals. It could be about reducing your energy consumption, it could be about your waste recycling, or various other aspects as to. So there's got to be a clear mechanism how we can onboard these kind of startups that can help you get there.
Thanks, Mithun. And I think you brought up a very important and a very interesting point, that it is not just about investing and giving money to these startups, but ultimately it's also about how these startups who are working on social sector problems or specific issues can actually help your organization and at a macro level again in general, and how they can be deployed as well and not just invested in. So I think, yeah, because at the end of the day, it is important to understand how these startups are solving problems which are not a business problem. They are problems for the society as a whole. So I think it is important to help them understand as well what their potential is and how their market size is. So very important point, and I think we've started on a great note in terms of understanding more about responsible investing, and again from very different types of stakeholders here, right? And one of the most important questions for this webinar, because there's also a lot of startups who are watching this, right? And ESG has been, I would say, the term for the last 1 or 2 years, which has gained a lot of importance as a framework, not just in startup investing, I would say at an overall level, at an international level as well, whether it's G20, whether it's World Economic Forum, all the multilateral organizations, all nations are working, have, sort of pivoted their focus on ESG framework. So just picking up from that, I would request, Lavanya, if you can share your understanding of what ESG framework is, and for all the startups who are here with us today, for help to help them also understand what investors are looking at in the social impact sector as well.
Sure, absolutely. I think if we just take ESG for a minute and the way that term has been framed, at least as far as our fund is concerned, the way we look at it is there's economic viability, there's environmental protection, then there is social equity, and then there is governance and how on an ongoing basis you will maintain that social contract of trust with your limited partners, with the other stakeholders in the ecosystem, with your customers as a investee company. And the way we think about this is every organization, and we invest only in tech companies. So, in many ways, the environmental piece, which has to do with the direct impact this organization has with the planet, is more to do with the ecosystems this company is typically powering, as opposed to its direct impact either through production or through actual industrial waste or stuff like that. So on the environmental side, it's typically a second order impact we look at. And we're very careful about defining for different companies the kind of variables they need to consider on the environmental protection side. On the social side, I think we're very sort of intentional about how the organization deals with its people, with its customers, and with other stakeholders in the ecosystem. And depending on the kind of workforce that's employed, depending on the kind of customers the corporation has, the focus of the social part will be quite different. And then from a governance perspective, one part is, of course, board level governance, making sure there's adequate representation of women directors, making sure there's diversity on the board with independent directors, making sure that there's a very high quality auditor in place, giving good guidance on what types of internal controls need to be put in place such that this growth stage startup that we've come into will eventually be worthy of being a publicly traded company. So on the ESG side, these are the types of considerations and work streams we have with our companies. I think one overarching point, which really, both as Manoj early on said, comes from the LP side as well as now from the customer facing side is customers are very woke, right? They want to consume products that have traceability. They want the story. For them, it's not just about, oh, I'm eating this chocolate or I'm consuming this service. It's like, why is this important? Who is behind it? what is the story? Is there a community around this? So I think the way we as consumers have evolved, and millennials and Gen Z are way more sort of representative of this, is they are asking for some of this, right? It's coming, and to my earlier point of this becoming an imperative, customers are also making this an imperative. And so the way we guide our companies is to be on the front foot of ESG, even if they don't have to today, even if today they're not bound by certain disclosures. We encourage them to start being ready for those disclosures and to start being ready for just broadly and transparently communicating stakeholder engagement and impact. So I think as a growth stage fund, this is how we look at it. And the very interesting thing about when generational transfer of wealth happens globally is typically the traditional custodians of wealth lose 70 to 80% of that when this generational transfer happens, right? So when millennials and Gen Zs are inheriting these vast amounts of wealth, they may not go to traditional asset managers if they do not have strategies that align with what it is they feel that wealth should be deployed to. And so I think we're seeing a sort of, in a very positive way, a confluence of some of these more structural shifts, making ESG shine and become sort of something everybody is focused on, which often is what gives that wind in the sails for something to become widely accepted, widely invested in.
That's actually very interesting, Lavanya, what you mentioned about one, of course, because you are an investor, right? So you don't have a specific mandate and specific firms that you look at for ESG, but it's something that you try to sort of incorporate across your investments, which is important for all the investors, I would say, and becoming more and more imperative to follow as well. And sort of incorporating all of that mechanisms into the startups that you're also investing in and also mentoring to an extent, right? And Manoj, from that perspective, only because you again operate on a very different spectrum of investing, wherein you're specifically investing in, I would say, sectors wherein, as you mentioned, there are not a lot of traditional investments flowing and not a lot of VCs are investing. So I think one question, is there any, because as Lavanya mentioned, in a traditional VC, what they are also trying to do right now is make ESG mandatory across, or looking at it from a lens of ESG, every investment from a lens of ESG. But whereas for an organization like Social Alpha, and in generally also in social impact investing, I would say it would be more prominent in terms of how you look at when you're looking at a startup company. And I think you did also mention that there are specific sectors that you focus on, which is the metrics that you've sort of created. Can you one shine a light on some of the which sectors which are there in this area, wherein more of social impact investing is required? And also, how do you look at your investing framework? Because while you mentioned that you're a non-profit agency, but at the end of the day, when you're investing, then what is your, I would say, a KPI that you look at when you invest in a startup? Is it more on a social level KPI that you look at? So looking forward to
Thanks.
your views.
These are very good questions, Neha. And thanks, Lavanya and Mithun, for setting up the tone. So, see, we work in, as I mentioned earlier, right? We identify market failure, right? And we work in those areas. And one of the reasons for setting up Social Alpha was government is doing a lot of work in infrastructure and promoting entrepreneurship and innovation, but government cannot do everything, right? So resource allocation is a problem everywhere. We are a large country with limited resources. So how can we create a private sector equivalent, right? So that while government brings more and more schemes for promoting innovation and entrepreneurship, how do we supplement and complement it with the private sector capital? And our source of capital cannot be the LP capital, but in the same families and the same, pools of wealth, you also have philanthropic capital, right? So we target the different pocket of the same LPs who invest in private equity and venture capital funds that comes from their philanthropic capital, right? And corporate CSR, philanthropy, family offices. And our approach to them is, look, we are actually creating a pipeline of companies which in future will be investable and in the process create impact. But these are high risk areas and these will not meet your investment thesis if it comes through, typical pooled capital models, right? So you need much longer horizon. You don't have to have a predetermined IRR, and you have to have a larger level of risk appetite, which government does, and which in private sector can only be done through philanthropy. And then we build our thesis, right? So we are always working on problem statements, identify problem statements which are unresolved or partially resolved, and then scout for innovators and startups, right? So our approach is problem driven. So instead of startups coming to us, we actually do a lot of scouting, right? And I'll give you an example, right? So like a scientist in National Chemical Laboratory who has been working on an alternative to lithium ion battery, can we use sodium ion battery considering India does not have security in lithium, right? Long-term climate adoption and transition will depend upon our ability to have alternatives to lithium ion batteries or new material development, right? Plastic replacement, circularity in economy. Healthcare, like you want to make healthcare more accessible and affordable, then you have to reduce the cost of diagnostics and devices. But these things may take 5 years in research, another 5 years in product development, then testing, clinical trials, regulatory approval. So these are very high risk areas, and the risk reduces when you are closer to the market, right? And at that point of time, investment capital might be, interested in that. So our biggest challenge is to identify what we have to do and what we don't have to do, right? So anything and everything that is already happening in the market, we have to stop any temptation of doing that, because then we would be competing with private capital pools, right? So that's very clear. So identifying problems, and our effort has to be in continuously de-risking by providing them labs, providing them mentoring, providing them capital, and it could be non-dilutive and dilutive capital both, right? So when we invest in the companies, we may give them a grant for product development, and at some point of time we may take an equity position in that, right? But if there is any exit, this exit money, I don't have to distribute it to my donors. It goes back to the same pool. So your question, how do we evaluate? We have two measures, right? One, are we solving the right problem? And two, are we solving the right problem while creating value, and are we deploying this value back for the same cause, right? Not distributing, because our LPs gave us money not for distributing, but to create the impact, right? So our pool of capital also has to increase, and number of successful companies must increase, right? So it's been 6 years. To 2016 we started. I am happy to share with you that 4 companies from our portfolio have received corporate interest, which means the corporations who did not want to invest in the R&D wanted to acquire these companies. That shows some alignment with their goals. And 3 companies have received Series A capital, right? But it takes time from the time you curate innovation to get them ready for Series A. Now, we don't have money or charter to do Series A investment, but bringing a company to a level where a mainstream Series A investor is interested in the company demonstrates that you have, transitioned them and made them successful. So this, we use the word technology readiness level, right? So shifting TRL of companies from TRL 1 to 5, 5 to 8, 8 to 9, and making them investment ready is a good proxy for attracting market, right? If the market is interested in what you're doing, that means you are doing the right thing. So it's too early, right? I don't call it success. It's a proof of concept. We have to scale it up now.
Thanks, Manoj. I think they're very interesting that, of course, social alpha, and of course, you also look at startups like problem solvers of social issues and environmental issues, which is in a way that how government also looks at startups, because when we are also looking at startups, we look at what at the ground reality, the problem they are solving. And one of the important part about responsible investing, I think, also is to handhold your startups from point 0 to point 100, and by acting as, I would say, like an incubator or a discovery fund, or just being there in their journey. It's very, very important to be with them till the time they get that Series A, which is also a part of responsible investing. So great work there. And I would now shift the gears to Mithun here, who's as from Manoj, it is extremely, again, a completely different spectrum, where you come from a bank wherein, I would say, the risk risk level of investing would be much, much smaller than what a social alpha would be, or what, a trifecta capital would be. So because your risk appetite is already relatively low, how does the perspective of social and environmental capital also gets on the table? And also I would want to understand again, because it is a corporate at the end of the day, how does CSR also play an important part here? Because CSR, while might be a small amount, but can be extremely important for responsible investing, if not for direct investors, but for banks, for corporates. So if you can just highlight the role of CSR also here and talk a little bit about that.
Sure, Neha, that's a great question. See, there's sometimes a misnomer that social impact businesses cannot be, financially viable, and I'm sure Manoj will agree that's not the case. You have a good amount of impact startups today. Look at somebody like a Fool or a Lalten, they've done phenomenal work, and it doesn't mean that they're not financially viable startups. So there's no reason why, as a bank, that we would not be able to service or cater to these kind of startups. So that's one misnomer that we need to change and build awareness. There's a clear difference between what's a not-profit and a social impact startup. A social impact startup can be a very viable investment slash lending prospect. And as far as we do at HDFC, we have a fairly robust, I would say, one of the best CSR programs when it comes to supporting social impact startups. And in fact, we have this year partnered with Startup India for this particular program, wherein the idea is to reach out to incubators across the country and make available grants to their incubatees. And this could be anything from, say, 25 lakhs to close to a crore. That's how we have structured it, and it's up to the incubator as to how they distribute these funds within their incubators. See, the objective here is to make grants available at the earliest stage when the risk is maximum, so that somebody like a Manoj can come and then handhold them and probably do follow-on investment. So that's how we have structured the CSR program. So over the last 4-5 years, I'm happy to tell you that close to 45 incubators and more importantly, about 165 startups have been benefited through these grants. And these are pure play grants where, they are allowed to go about, say, product development or building their team and very early on in their journeys. So that's a program where, we have been able to, as an organization, create a significant impact.
Great, thanks a lot, Mithun. And I think, yes, as you mentioned, that CSR does play an important role, and it is definitely, and of course, it is I would say, a misnomer when it has to be a choice between working on a social cause versus, getting profits. And while, of course, this masterclass is on responsible investing, but it's also important for startups to understand that both the things can work in tandem with each other as well. And because there's so many unicorns right now who are working in a lot of social areas. So, and this is something I want, I would say, all three of your opinions in. That for a startup who is working in the impact sector, who is working in social impact or a particular macroeconomic problem, how do they make that business profitable? How do they look at not just the social issue but also figure out the profit part of it? And also, how do they approach investors, and who do they approach exactly, and what can be their USP when they're approaching an investor versus a pure play tech agency? So any advice for these kind of startups would be very important from all of your perspective. Anyone who would like to go first here?
On who do they approach? Definitely Manoj is going to be one of the early guys you need to approach. And as far as I think where we are today compared to about 4-5 years back, there's a fair amount of grants available to early stage startups. Be it through what the central government is providing through your Startup India Seed Fund, where I think up to about 20 lakhs is given to startups for your prototype building, or there's a lot of work thankfully today from respective state governments as well in terms of either filing your patent, your grants. So we need to build awareness about these programs within the community. So I So that's one area, and quite clearly we see increasing number of interest from the impact sector community is growing. So there's a lot more investors that you would see in this space today, compared to a few years back. So that's my take on this.
May I come in now?
Of course, Manoj, please feel
Yeah,
free.
I just want, all the startup founders and entrepreneurs, innovators to think of history of India, right? Our startup ecosystem in 1980s, 90s was call center, BPO, and IT. And the value driver then was labor arbitrage, right? So India was cheap, right? Back office of the world, we created value out of that. Then on the top of our internet revolution, our digital economy, and all the changes that happened in India, we have now these 100 plus unicorns. And see, in most cases, they are built on our digital economy, right? A lot of them, large targeted, large addressable market, getting a large amount of capital to grow and capture markets here, right? So this happened. A lot of problems that we face today in livelihoods, in healthcare, and in climate also require new inventions or new innovations, because these are some very complex. Like for example, in agri-tech, you can always build another e-commerce or aggregator engine or a value chain, transition model. But if you have to regenerate the soil, right, you need science. If you have to capture carbon from the air and sequestrate it, you need science. If you need a new diagnostic device that does quick diagnosis and gives you result and a new vaccine, you need science. So there, if you create IP, if you create solutions, or if your approach is product and platform driven, and you are protecting your inventions through intellectual property and patents, you will actually make a lot of money. If you solve the problem of nutrition in India, malnutrition in India, or if you solve the problem of soil regeneration, if you solve the problem of water resource management, climate resilient agriculture, right? The unicorns over the next 20 years will be in climate, health, and livelihoods, because the unicorns in e-commerce, payment, food delivery are happening now, right? The fintech, edtech is happening now. The capital is available there. But next generation of unicorns, the unicorns of 2030s and 2040s, will be in batteries, will be in nutrition, food security, right? And that opportunity will come from science and technology. And that is where the early stage capital comes only from Government of India, and we are trying to do some private sector aggregation there. But eventually LP capital will come there. See, it takes time, right? 30 years back, nobody used to make airports and bridges in India and roads in India. Today, private sector makes the airport, bridge, and roads, right? So the capital is not a problem. LP capital will always go where investment opportunity is there, right? The VCs and private equity playbook will keep changing, right? Today we are running a Silicon Valley type playbook. Tomorrow it can be a completely different playbook. But we have to create the pipeline. We have to move up the value chain, right? Historically, India supplied labor to the world. Then we created, great IPs in like UPI or our payment system, our innovations in fintech, tech. But the next generation of startup, and I'm very pleased to say that we see a lot of these startups today in India who are doing science and technology innovation. They will become global leader, because for them, the entire world is, if you develop a new vaccine in India, it can be sold anywhere. If you develop a new MRI machine, it can compete with GE, Philips, and Siemens, right? The large multinational corporations out of our startup ecosystem are about to happen. Next 30 years are our story in products and global markets. And I think we have that right combination of, environment, the entrepreneurial risk taking. There is a revolution that is happening in country today. If you talk to PhD students, some of them would say, I don't want to be a faculty member, I want to do my startup. That is what is happening in India today. And I think that is very encouraging.
Neha, beautiful thoughts from both Manoj and Mithun. I just wanted to come in with an anecdotal example. So, 14 years back, I did a fellowship at a social venture called Embrace Global. And Embrace Global makes baby incubators for extreme affordability. They are still a startup, I guess a scale up now, and started out with a pure, impact oriented mission, not with a view to saying this is the kind of profit a company like this can generate over time. So was started out with much more of a non-profit mindset. And the goal was, can we get help for the most vulnerable parts of our population to help with neonatal mortality? Right? So the problem statement was such that it was not obvious that there was an ability to pay in this population. And therefore, it made sense to set this up with an impact orientation and as a nonprofit. As they piloted the product, as they started to see wide ranging impact in a bunch of use cases, from the hilly regions of Nepal to small villages in Tamil Nadu, they caught the attention of GE Healthcare. And GE said, we have a play in incubators, but we do not have a play in infant warmers because we didn't think that this was a as within our range of products, something that had a big TAM. But given what you guys have managed to innovate, to Manoj's point of technology actually sometimes being able to be something that drives adoption at scale, they wanted to partner. And so Embrace Global, in that summer where I did that fellowship with them, actually did their Excel model of splitting the business into a for-profit arm and a non-profit arm, because they continued to feel like the most vulnerable populations they wanted to address could not actually pay to make this a viable for-profit business. But then there was a more higher-end product in partnership with GE, where there was a different go-to-market strategy, where it would also be for the masses, but it would be at a price point where it was affordable, where there was a potential to generate over time a reasonable rate of return. And so I think my takeaway from that, I was, of course, young in my career and very idealistic, but I still felt like if there is the ability for the population you are trying to impact to pay, then by all means, you should go ahead and try to set up something that is self-sustaining, that is profitable, that over time can be an independent, profitable enterprise. But to Manoj's early point on, there will be some gaps that have been identified where you may not be able to see an ability to pay, but it is still valuable to save those lives and have that impact. Maybe it continues to be funded by a different set of capital providers. But I think it's important for the entrepreneur to, at those pivotal decision-making points, match the capital to the objectives with the data available to them at that point of the decision tree, which could change, every few years based on how you innovate and what it is that product can now do, given that it could have surpassed your own expectations as a founder when you set out to do something, right? Sometimes, we get surprised by the results of our own research. So I feel the parting thought to entrepreneurs from this story of mine is, there's a problem you're trying to solve and you're passionate and mission driven. And sometimes that may continue to need nonprofit or impact oriented funding. But there could be a point in the journey where it can be just a profitable enterprise. And to what both Mithun and Manoj were saying, those two objectives need not be mutually exclusive, right? You can have a very profitable, very impactful enterprise. But I think it's up to the founder and the investors to align on those objectives, just so at the end of the day, we're all signing the same contract.
Thank you, Lavanya. And I think some extremely, extremely interesting and important points have come up in what all three of you have said. And I think, as Manoj also mentioned, the next set of unicorns would be startups which are working in the area of social impact, because you already have unicorns in many, many other sectors. So as Lavanya, you also mentioned that we're at a cusp of a revolution wherein everyone, not just startups, not just investors, but all the stakeholders across the globe are looking at ESG, are looking at their social responsibility, environment responsibility. So at the end of the day, it is something which is going to be at the top of the mind for all the stakeholders, whether it's customers, whether it's startups, whether it's businesses, government, and that's how the businesses will also pivot. And one important point which Mithun and Manoj also highlighted was knowing if you have the potential to solve a huge social problem, and as Lavanya mentioned, sometimes also knowing that you might not. So it is also important for all the startups watching in, and whoever the stakeholders are, to also understand if they have the potential to do something big, and then reach out to the relevant stakeholders for it, whether it's a social alpha, Trifecta, or HDFC, or the government itself, but also to understand wherein their limitations lie. So assessing a startup is also important for the founder. So, extremely enriching thoughts from all three of you here. Thanks a lot. I will take up one question, which is from the audience side before we end. So, one question is, and I think Lavanya and Mithun, this would be more specifically for you. For a social enterprise, what do you look at while you're investing in a social impact startups, particularly because, of course, relatively there is a low return on investment on a social impact startup. So what is the perspective of an investor when they're looking at a startup which is solving such a problem? Is the perspective more along the lines of, okay, there are other stakeholders to support them, this is not somewhere we need to get in, or is the perspective something different, or is there something else that you look at? So Lavanya, Mithun, any inputs from your side here?
Mithun, you want me to go first?
Please.
Sure. So that's a hard question, Neha. I think, look, I'm a custodian of capital, right? We have a 250 million fund. We have a bunch of limited partners to whom we've said that we will invest in category leading tech companies that will, in all likelihood, see a liquidity event in a 1 to 5 year time frame. So that is the promise we've made to our investors. And so a social enterprise that fits those objectives, where it's a category leader, where there is the ability to see a 3 times return in a 3 to 5 year period, where there is the ability for us as investors to harvest that investment and return that money to the people who have invested in us. If all those fund objectives are met, we would be delighted to invest in a diverse range of companies, including startups that focus on social impact. But I think the important thing to also recognize is something that was discussed earlier in this webinar, which is duration, right? It's really important to marry the duration of your fund with the duration of what the entrepreneur believes is the natural cadence of that startup's journey. Because if there's a mismatch between those two, there is very likely to be just unnecessary friction between founder and investor. I think there are inevitable points of friction along the way because there will be business cycles, there will be missed business plans, there will be points where people go back and forth. But I think some very fundamental principles should not be compromised, and I strongly believe duration is one of them, because otherwise you will put unnecessary pressure as an investor on the startup founder to say, I need an exit, right? And that guy is like, hey, I'm building for the next 30 years. I mean, if you have a 7-year fund, that's not really, something I can do anything about. So I think it's very important to have a meeting of minds on an array of things, including duration. So if we look at something in the impact space, we will look very closely at these parameters in addition to, of course, how has the company grown? Does it have, strong product market fit? How are the gross margins trending? Are you seeing a path to very good return on equity? We look at all of those, but we will also look at some of these objectives the founders trying to solve for and see if it's sensible within our fund life that can be achieved.
Thanks a lot, Lavanya. You're completely right on the duration part. What Manoj also mentioned about also looking at, your own duration. How long does a startup need support for? How long does it make sense for a startup to for it to be in your portfolio as well, and do the returns from it and the investment in terms of time and money, both of it makes sense to it, right? So thanks a lot for that, Mithun. Anything from your side here?
So not very different from what Lavanya mentioned. So we don't have a separate vertical to look at impact investing per se. So we would look at it as a standalone case, regardless of which startup we are investing into. So that's been our approach, because at the end of the day, we have a fiduciary responsibility as well. So as it stands today, I'd say that's how we would evaluate every startup that we would invest or support for that matter.
Thanks a lot, Mithun. One last question, I think, before we wrap this up, which is related to the third part of ESG, which is governance, right? While we've talked a lot about environmental sustainability and general sustainability and the social responsibility of startups, governance is something which not just startups but all the companies need to be extremely mindful of. And a lot of startups, when they're starting new, is governance is not a metric and not, I would say, an operational area they focus on a lot, because they're focused on building up the teams, investments, funding, etc. So, what are your views on the governance aspect of it? What do investors and incubators, etc., look at when they're looking for governance in startups? One thing I think Lavanya did mention was about representation of women as well in your board, in your structure, in your leadership. So that's one aspect of it. But anything else that you specifically look at in the governance part of the framework? Open to all three of you.
So maybe I can just embellish a little bit and then allow Manoj and Mithun to have parting words. I think governance, Neha, as a growth stage startup is critical because you're preparing for being worthy of a permanent source of capital. Right? I think governance should be important at every stage, but like you said, in the very early days, there are many competing priorities, including just getting from 0 to 1 and finding that product market fit, finding that customer love, recruiting your top talent. So I think there's a lot of energy that goes into pulling together to get this vision off the ground. But I think as you enter growth stage, the startup also has a bunch of people coming in from the outside with different DNA. So there's a certain acclimatization of new talent that needs to happen. You need to make sure that the foundational principles and the culture you intended to set up continues with growing the team and growing your leadership, right? And I think apart from board governance, we also look very closely at things like how is the auditor being appointed? Are there good internal controls? Is there good dialogue between the investor group and the founder on a monthly basis as the numbers come out? Is the founder good at surfacing bad news early? Are they getting ready to show some predictability of reporting? Because that is what eventually the public markets will demand. And maybe that's a 3 to 5 year journey. But there's no time too early to start if you've already raised growth stage capital. So I think some of these things become very important at the stage at which we come in. And we work closely with founders to say, we understand you have many competing priorities, but allow us to give you the benefit of decades of experience to say, maybe these are 2-3 priorities for this quarter. And then as you address these, maybe we can increase the array of things you need to focus on.
Thanks, Lavanya. Manoj and Mithun, do you want to add to that?
So, see, because we work very early, this introduction to compliance, governance, regulatory issues happens to the startup in our first interactions with them. They suddenly realize that they have not been filing, some of them have not been filing company law returns, their cap tables are not well organized, a lot of issues in tax and other things. So it actually takes sometimes 6 months to just fix that. And we have a very competent team of advisors and lawyers who help us with that. But at the end of it, if you don't fix these problems at the seed level, then you will have a bigger problem at the seed level, right? So governance, introduction to governance now starts at that stage when you raise your first round of capital, right? And then, board observers or board representation, timely, and a lot of time, because the startups are either bootstrapping or working on a very small shoestring budget, living on cash flows. Uh, Sometimes they start thinking that it's an overhead. Why should I be spending so much money in, accounting and legal and other issues? But this is the cost of doing business, and that realization starts happening at that point of time. But one thing I would like all early stage startups to also understand, that don't underestimate the power of non-dilutive capital. It is not only for NGOs and non-profit world. As a startup founder, you should know all sources of non-dilutive capital, whether it's government of India or philanthropy, incubators, accelerators, prize money. Some of our most successful startups did not dilute at all in the first 2 or 3 years, and they survived on prize money. Please understand, dilution is the easiest thing to do, and temptation of diluting is very high, but you dilute at a very, very low valuation. So please bootstrap, please raise prize money, write these small 10 lakh, 5 lakh rupees. There's no harm in doing all that, because you are building your business at that point of time, right? And second thing is, don't underestimate the power of bootstrapping. Sometimes very good startups become unicorn without diluting anything, and we have a couple of examples in our country also, right? So it's not about lack of investment. Sometimes you may actually not need the investment if your idea is really disruptive and breakthrough. So that debate we do less, because we talk about multi-series investments and unicorn all about, but we have success stories in our own portfolio. We have some companies who don't need money, right? So please don't underestimate that. And government does a lot of non-dilutive capital through departments like BIRAC, DBT, DST, Niti Aayog, Startup India Fund. So many, every ministry has some scheme for promoting startups and innovation. Please explore that, because that's the lowest cost capital you could ever get in your life.
Yes, so to add to what Manoj and Lavanya said, I think governance related issues tend to get a bit ignored in the beginning, not because of anything else, but for early stage founders, it's a new battle every day. So something like this is the last thing on your mind. But what's important to note is, see, if you're in a very good setup, like say a part of Social Alpha or a good incubation center, they would have kind of built or made sure the right set of people are a part of your organization, in terms of having the right legal team or compliance experts. But it's just good practice to start this on early for founders, because sooner than later you are going to have more stakeholders, you're going to have investors, so you would rather start early on matters like these.
Thank you, Mithun. We do have a lot of other questions, but with the paucity of time, I won't take those. But what a beautiful way to end it also, Manoj, with your point that while, of course, we are talking about responsible investing today and the power of investing, but it is also important to have and know the role of sustainability and investing, and take investments also sustainably, understand the cost of capital which is there, and make sure that your startup is working at the juncture where they know how much investment they want to take. Do they actually need investments? Are the government funds enough? Are the prize money enough? So extremely relevant point there. Thank you so much to all three of you, Lavanya, Manoj, Mithun, for joining today. I have personally learned a lot over the past 1 hour from all three of you, and I wish this masterclass was longer. But thanks a lot for your time given to us, and hoping everyone who has joined us today has had fruitful insights from the webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Neha.
Neha.
Thank you.
It was great
Thank
to be a
you.
part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neha,
Thank you, everyone.
Lavanya,
To everyone,
Mithun. Great talking to all of you.
thank
Thanks,
you for
Likewise.
Neha.
everyone
Bye,
watching.
everyone.
We will
Bye,
be back
Neha.
with the webinar tomorrow again. on private sector investments specifically. So please tune in at the same time on the Startup India channel. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.